There is a silence that exists between stars. It is not the absence of sound, for sound has never lived in the void. It is something deeper, something older. It is the silence of patience, of cosmic indifference, of time measured not in years, but in the cooling of suns and the slow spiral of galaxies toward oblivion. I have listened to that silence for longer than most species have existed. My name is Catherine Vorolith. I was, a senior arbiter of the Valanthi Collective, born in the shadow of our home world's seventh moon, educated in the floating academies of Fesseran Prime, and granted my position after centuries of service to a civilization that had watched the birth and death of 1,000 lesser cultures. We, Valanthi, measured our history in 12,000 years. 12,000 years of unbroken progress, of careful expansion, of philosophical refinement that elevated us beyond the crude impulses of younger species. We had mapped the neural pathways of consciousness itself. We had learned to fold space like cloth. We had touched the edge of dimensions that lesser minds could not comprehend, and we had returned, enlightened. We believed we understood the universe. We believed we understood our place within it. We were wrong about so many things, but we were most wrong about the humans. I remember the first time I saw their species catalogued in our archives. It was 312 years before the fall, during my training period as a junior cultural analyst. The file was brief, almost dismissive. Sol system, carbon-based bipedal primates, fractured governance, primitive energy infrastructure, violent internal history, technological development early interstellar, classification monitor, threat assessment negligible. I remember thinking how unremarkable they seemed. Just another young species stumbling toward the stars, making all the familiar mistakes that young species make. They would either mature into something worth noticing, or they would destroy themselves, as so many others had done. Either way, they were not our concern. They were not anyone's concern. That was the consensus among every elder race in the galaxy. The Valanthi, the Cathrin Dominion, the Sistran Hierarchy, the Void Speakers of the Outer Rim. We all looked at humanity and saw the same thing. A species too fractured, too young, too damaged by their own violent nature to ever become significant. We were so certain. Certainty, I have learned, is the first step toward blindness. The war with the Hollow came upon us like a disease given form. They emerged from the spaces between dimensions, from the places where reality grows thin and mathematics becomes poetry. We do not know what they were before they became what they are now. Perhaps they were once a species like us, organic and bound by the laws of matter. Perhaps they were something else entirely, a thought that gained substance, a nightmare that learned to move. What we know is what they did. They consumed, not for sustenance, not for territory, not for any reason we could understand. They consumed because consumption was their nature, the way breathing is ours. They moved through our outer colonies like a scythe through wheat, and where they passed, nothing remained. Not ruins, not corpses, not even the memory of light. Just emptiness, as if those worlds had never existed at all. The Cathrin Dominion fell first. 17 billion souls scattered across 200 worlds, erased in less than a cycle. We received their final transmission, a scream of data, corrupted and fragmented, that simply stopped mid-syllable, as if someone had cut the wire of their existence.
Then the sistren.
Then the void speakers. Then us.
When the hollow reached Valanthe space, we fought with everything we had. 12,000 years of technological development, weapons that could crack planets, shields that could withstand the fury of supernovas, minds networked together in vast cognitive arrays, processing tactical data at speeds that bent the perception of time.
We lost. World after world fell into silence. Thessaron Prime, where I had spent the happiest centuries of my life, was among the first to go. I watched from the bridge of the eternal vigilance as the planet simply ceased to be, not destroyed, but unmade, as if the universe had forgotten it ever existed. I remember the cold that settled into my bones that day. Not physical cold, but something deeper. The chill of understanding that everything I had believed about my civilization's permanence was a lie we had told ourselves. We were not eternal. We were not even particularly durable. We were simply next. By the time our government began discussing terms of surrender, or as they euphemistically called it, cultural integration, we had lost 72% of our population. Our fleets were scattered, broken, hiding in the shadows of dead systems. Our leadership had retreated to bunkers beneath Valanthe Prime, pretending to govern a civilization that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. I was one of the few who argued against surrender, not because I believed we could win. I had abandoned that hope when I watched Thessaron Prime die, but because I had studied the Hollow long enough to know that surrender was not a concept they recognized. They did not negotiate. They did not integrate. They consumed, and when they were finished consuming, they moved on to consume something else. Surrender would not save us. It would simply make us easier to digest. But the Council would not listen. The Council was tired and frightened, and desperate for any path that might lead away from extinction. They sent envoys to the Hollow, wrapped in diplomatic protocols that meant nothing to creatures beyond meaning. The envoys did not return. Nothing returned. And so, in the final weeks before our homeworld fell, I did something that would have been unthinkable just a few years before, something that marked me as either a visionary or a traitor, depending on who was judging. I went to the humans. The journey to their territory took 3 weeks in a damaged diplomatic vessel held together by emergency welds and desperate prayer. I traveled alone, without authorization, without support, with nothing but a failing ship and a message that amounted to a single word: help. I did not expect them to answer. Why would they? We had ignored them for centuries. We had classified them as primitive, dismissed their achievements as crude, predicted their self-destruction with the casual confidence of those who believed themselves superior. We had never offered them alliance, never shared our knowledge, never treated them as anything more than a curiosity to be monitored and forgotten. And now, in our darkest hour, I was crawling to their door with my hand extended, asking them to save us from the consequences of our own arrogance. I expected them to laugh. I expected them to refuse. I expected them to demand something, tribute perhaps, or submission, some acknowledgement of their ascendance and our fall. It would have been the natural response. It would have been what we would have done. But humans, I would learn, are not natural. They are something else entirely. My first indication that I had misjudged them came when I reached the edge of their territory. I had expected to find chaos. The intelligence reports I had reviewed during my journey painted a picture of a species still fragmented, still divided by the old national and ideological boundaries that had defined their early history. Their worlds should have been competing, arguing, pulling in different directions as the galaxy burned around them. Instead, I found order, not the cold, crystalline order of the Valanthi, where everything was organized according to ancient protocols and hierarchical traditions. This was something different, something organic. Ships moved in patterns that seemed almost random at first glance, but revealed themselves upon closer analysis as an intricate dance of logistics and purpose. Communication channels hummed with quiet efficiency. Stations and outposts operated with the seamless coordination of cells in a living organism. They had been preparing. Not for us, I realized. Not specifically for our arrival. They had been preparing for something, anything, as if they had always known that disaster would come and had simply been waiting to discover what form it would take. I was intercepted by a patrol vessel 3 light minutes from their nearest station. The ship was utilitarian in design. No elegant curves, no artistic flourishes, just efficient angles and functional systems. It was not beautiful. It was not impressive. It was, I would later realize, exactly what it needed to be. A human voice came through my communications array, speaking in the common galactic tongue with an accent I could not quite place. Valanthi vessel, this is UNS Perseverance. We've been monitoring your approach. You're welcome to proceed to Station Aegis for docking. Medical and technical personnel will be standing by. That was all. No demands, no interrogation, no posturing. Just a calm acknowledgement of my presence and an offer of assistance. I did not know what to make of it. Station Aegis was larger than I had expected. Not impressive by Valanthi standards, our stations had been works of art, orbital sculptures that took centuries to complete, but functional in a way that suggested careful thought had gone into every component. The docking bay where I landed was clean, well-maintained, and staffed by humans who moved with the quiet efficiency of those who had performed their duties countless times before. They did not stare at me as I disembarked, though I knew my presence must have been unusual. A Valanthi in their territory was rare enough. A Valanthi arriving alone in a damaged vessel, unannounced and unauthorized, was practically unheard of. But they simply processed my arrival with professional courtesy, asking only the questions necessary to ensure my needs were met. Did I require medical attention? Was my vessel in need of repair? Did I have dietary restrictions they should be aware of? Simple questions. Practical questions. Human questions. I was escorted to a meeting room and asked to wait. The room was small and undecorated, containing nothing but a table, several chairs, and a window that looked out into the void. I sat alone for nearly an hour, watching ships move in the darkness, trying to understand what I was seeing. When the door finally opened, I expected a military commander or a diplomatic officer, someone draped in the ceremonial trappings of authority, as would have been customary in any Valanthi interaction. Instead, a woman entered alone, wearing clothing that was practical rather than formal. Her hair was gray, her face lined with age, her movements unhurried. She sat across from me without ceremony and placed her hands on the table. "Arbiter Vorlith," she said. "My name is Marin Cole. I'm here to listen." I blinked, momentarily confused by her directness. "You know who I am?" "We keep records," she said. "Not as extensive as yours, probably, but enough. You were a cultural analyst before the war. You specialized in threat assessment. You argued against the classification of the hollow as a containable phenomenon. She paused. You were right. I was too late, I said. Being right means nothing if no one listens. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But it means something that you're here now, speaking to us. That took a different kind of courage.
I did not know how to respond to that. In all my dealings with other species, I had never encountered one that acknowledged courage in an enemy, or whatever I was to them. A beggar, perhaps? A refugee? A representative of a civilization that had once dismissed them as insignificant.
You know why I am here, I said. I can guess. She leaned back in her chair. The Valanthi Collective is falling. The Hollow have reached your inner systems. Your government is considering surrender, and you know that surrender is not an option. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. You came to ask for help. Yes. Why us? The question hung in the air between us. I understood its weight. She was not asking for practical justifications, military assets, strategic positions, potential alliances. She was asking something deeper, something more difficult to answer. Why us when you have spent centuries treating us as children? Why us when you predicted our failure and our irrelevance? Why us of all the powers in the galaxy when you would not even look in our direction until your own house was burning? I could have lied. I could have offered diplomatic platitudes about mutual benefit and strategic necessity, but something in her eyes told me she would know the difference, and that the difference would matter. Because you survived, I said. She did not respond, but her expression shifted slightly, waiting. We monitored your species for 300 years, I continued. We watched your wars, your famines, your plagues, your technologies that you turned against yourselves. We saw the weapons you built, the damage you inflicted on your own world, the countless times you stood at the edge of extinction. I paused, searching for the right words. We expected you to fail. Every model we ran, every projection we made suggested that a species as violent and divided as yours could not possibly survive long enough to reach the stars. But we did. Yes, you did. And more than that. I hesitated, feeling a weight in my chest that might have been shame. More than that, you grew, you changed. You took the worst parts of yourselves and somehow transformed them into something else. Something that we could not explain with our models or our predictions. Marin Cole was silent for a long moment. Her hands remained still on the table, and her face betrayed nothing of what she was thinking. I had the unsettling sense that she was waiting for me to understand something that I had not yet grasped. What do you think that something was? She asked finally. I do not know, I admitted, but I believe it is why you might be able to do what we could not. Survive the Hollow? Yes. She nodded slowly, as if I had passed some test I was not aware of taking. The Hollow are here because the galaxy is weak, not technologically. Technologically, most of the elder races were far more advanced than we are. But there's another kind of strength, one that your models couldn't measure. I waited for her to explain, but she did not. Instead, she stood up and gestured toward the door. Come with me, she said. There's something I want you to see. I followed Marin Cole through the corridors of Station Aegis, and with each step, my confusion deepened. The station was not what I had expected. The intelligence briefings I had reviewed described human infrastructure as functional but crude, reflecting a species still developing its understanding of large-scale orbital construction. What I saw was different. Not elegant, the Volanthi would never have called it elegant, but purposeful in a way that suggested long experience with constraint and necessity. Everything was designed to be repaired. Everything was designed to be replaced. Everything was designed to keep working even when parts failed, even when systems degraded, even when circumstances grew desperate. There was a philosophy embedded in the architecture, a philosophy of persistence and adaptation that I had not seen before in any species. We passed through a section of the station that had been converted into a refugee processing center. The people there were not human. I recognized Kythrin, Sistrin, even a few void speakers, survivors of civilizations that I had thought completely erased. They moved through the space, in various states of shock and recovery, tended by human personnel who spoke softly and moved carefully around them. "How many?" I asked. "Refugees? About 14 million on this station alone, another 60 million across our other facilities." Marin glanced at me. "We started preparing for this 2 years ago, when the Kaethoran Dominion first fell. We knew the Hollow wouldn't stop with them." "You knew?" "We suspected it was enough." I watched a human medic kneeling beside a Kaethoran child, speaking in slow, careful phrases that the translation system rendered as gentle reassurance. The child was crying, a reaction I had not known Kaethoran were capable of, and the medic was simply present, offering comfort without expectation. "Why?" I asked.
Marin did not pretend to misunderstand. "Because it's what we do," she said. "It's what we've always done, even when we were terrible at it, even when we failed. We try again. We do better. We help."
"Even those who dismissed you? Even those who predicted your failure?"
"Especially them." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the words. "We know what it's like to fail. We know what it's like to face extinction. We know what it's like to stand at the edge of the abyss and wonder if anyone will be there to catch us when we fall." She looked at me directly. "No one was there for us, Arbiter. We caught ourselves. But that doesn't mean we want others to experience that same loneliness." I did not know what to say. The Volanthi had always believed that strength came from superiority, from being above others, beyond them, separated from them by the gulf of advancement. We had never considered that true strength might come from something else entirely.
From connection. From the willingness to reach down into the darkness and pull someone up.
From the refusal to let anyone fall alone.
Marin led me to an observation deck at the heart of the station. The windows here were larger, offering a panoramic view of the space beyond. What I saw made me stop mid-stride. Ships. Thousands of them. They hung in the darkness like a constellation made solid, moving in patterns that my mind struggled to follow. Some were military vessels. I recognized the silhouettes of destroyers and carriers and dreadnoughts. Others were civilian ships, converted for purposes I could not immediately identify. Still others were hybrid constructions, cobbled together from components that should not have been compatible, but somehow were. "The United Human Fleet," Marin said, "or what we've assembled so far." "So far?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "We're still mobilizing. Colonies throughout our space are contributing ships, personnel, resources. We've been building for this moment for longer than you know." She paused. "We've been building for this moment since we first looked up at the stars and saw the darkness looking back." I stared at the fleet, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The Volanthi had possessed larger fleets, more advanced technology, greater resources in every measurable sense. And we had fallen. How could these humans, these primitive, fractured, underestimated humans, possibly hope to succeed where we had failed? "You cannot win," I said. "I do not say this to discourage you. I say it because it is true. The Hollow have consumed civilizations older and more powerful than both of ours combined. They exist outside the normal rules of warfare. They cannot be defeated by conventional means." "You're right," Marin said. I turned to face her, startled by the admission. "Then why are you doing this?" "Because winning isn't the goal." Her eyes reflected the distant lights of her fleet, and in that moment I saw something in them that I could not name. Not confidence, it was deeper than that. Not hope, it was darker than that. It was something ancient and terrible and beautiful, something that had been forged in the fires of 1,000 catastrophes. "The goal," she continued, "is not to die on our knees." The days that followed were an education in everything I had failed to understand about humanity. I was given quarters on Station Aegis, modest but comfortable, and granted access to non-classified areas of the station. In practical terms, this meant I could observe, question, and learn, though I was politely excluded from strategic discussions. I did not resent this exclusion. I was, after all, a representative of a species that had given the humans no reason to trust them. But even from the periphery, I saw enough to shake the foundations of my understanding. They were not preparing for war. They were preparing for something else entirely. I watched their engineers working on ships that had been damaged in earlier skirmishes with the Hollow. Their methods were unconventional. Where a Volanthi engineer would have replaced a damaged component with an identical replacement, a human engineer would adapt, improvise, integrate materials that had never been designed to work together. One vessel I observed had components from at least 7 different species fused into its hull, each modification ugly but functional. When I asked about this approach, the engineer, a young man with tired eyes and oil-stained hands, just shrugged. "We work with what we have," he said. "Always have. Waiting for perfect conditions means waiting forever." I watched their soldiers training in simulation chambers, running scenarios that made no logical sense. Overwhelmed positions, failing equipment, communication blackouts, impossible odds. Again and again, they practiced not winning, but surviving, not defeating the enemy, but enduring long enough to find a new angle of attack. When I asked about this, the training officer, an older woman with a prosthetic leg that she wore like a badge of honor, smiled grimly. "We've learned that victory often isn't an option," she said, "but survival is always worth fighting for. And sometimes, if you survive long enough, the situation changes." I watched their scientists studying the fragments of hollow technology that had been recovered from battlefields, pieces of the enemy that had been somehow captured before they could dissipate. The scientists approached these artifacts with a combination of scientific rigor and something almost like reverence, documenting every observation, testing every hypothesis, never giving up even when the results made no sense. When I asked about this, the lead researcher, a woman whose name I never learned, looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and too little sleep. "Every problem has a solution," she said. "We just have to find it. And if we can't find it, we have to invent it." There was a pattern here, I realized, a philosophy encoded in everything they did. Never accept defeat. Never stop trying. Never give up, no matter how hopeless the situation seems.
It was not wisdom in the sense that the Velanthi understood wisdom. Careful, measured, calculated. It was something rawer and more dangerous. It was the wisdom of survivors. The wisdom of those who have been to the edge of extinction and crawled back. On the fourth day, I was summoned to a meeting that I had not expected. The room was larger than the one where I had first met Marin Cole, but just as undecorated. A long table dominated the space, and around it sat humans in various states of formal and informal attire. Some wore military uniforms, others wore civilian clothes. A few looked like they had just come from factory floors or research labs, still bearing the marks of their work. At the head of the table sat a man I had not seen before. He was old, older than Marin, perhaps one of the oldest humans I had encountered. His face was weathered, his hands scarred, his eyes were the eyes of someone who had witnessed horrors beyond description and somehow found a way to continue. "Arbiter Vorolith," he said, "I'm Admiral Chen Wei. Thank you for joining us." I took the seat that was indicated for me. I was not aware that I was invited to strategic discussions. "You weren't," Chen Wei said, "but circumstances have changed. We've received intelligence that the Hollow have accelerated their advance. They'll reach Velanthi Prime within 3 standard days." The words hit me like a physical blow. 3 days. My home world, everything that remained of my civilization, would be consumed in 3 days. "We have a choice to make," Chen Wei continued. "We can continue our preparations and wait for the Hollow to come to us. That's the safe option. It gives us more time to build, to plan, to prepare. But it means abandoning Velanthi Prime." He paused. "Or we can move now. Engage the Hollow before they reach your homeworld, buy time for evacuation, and maybe learn something about how to fight them." "That would be suicide," I said. "Possibly." Chen Wei's expression did not change. "But we've decided to let you have a say in the matter. It's your world, after all. Your people. Your choice." I stared at him, unable to understand what I was hearing. They were offering to risk their fleet, their entire defensive strategy, for a species that had never done anything for them. A species that had dismissed them, ignored them, predicted their failure. "Why?" The question came out hoarse, broken. "Why would you do this?" Chen Wei leaned back in his chair. "Because we've been where you are, Arbiter. We've stood at the edge of annihilation, watching everything we built crumble around us. We've felt that hopelessness, that despair, that certainty that no one was coming to help." He looked at me with those ancient, terrible eyes, and we decided, a long time ago, that we would never let anyone else feel that alone if we had the power to prevent it. "Even if it costs you everything?" "Even then." He smiled, and there was something sad and beautiful in that smile. "We humans have a saying, Arbiter. It is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. But there's a version we don't share with outsiders, a version we keep for ourselves." I waited. "It's better to die reaching for someone else," Chen Wei said, "than to survive having turned away." The fleet launched within the hour. I watched from the observation deck as ship after ship broke formation and accelerated toward the transit point. The movement was smooth, coordinated, the result of months or years of preparation. But what struck me most was not the precision of their departure. It was the silence. There were no speeches, no fanfare, no dramatic declarations of purpose or intent. The ships simply went, their crews knowing what they were facing, knowing that many of them would not return, and choosing to go anyway. I thought of the Velanthi military tradition,
with its elaborate pre-battle rituals and ceremonial acknowledgments. I thought of the Catharin war chants and the Sistran battle prayers. All of those cultures had developed ways to mark the moment when warriors departed for possible death, ways to honor the sacrifice, ways to give meaning to the loss. The humans had none of that. Or rather, they had something else, something that did not require words. As the last ships disappeared into the transit point, I noticed Marin Cole standing beside me at the window. I had not heard her approach.
"You look confused," she said.
"I am trying to understand," I admitted. "You send your fleet to possible destruction and there is no ceremony, no ritual, no acknowledgement. We acknowledge it in our own way." She was quiet for a moment. "Every person on those ships has already said goodbye to the people they love. They did it in private, in their own words, in their own way. They don't need ceremony to know what they're doing or why. How do they find the courage, knowing what they face?"
Marin turned to look at me. "You really don't understand us, do you?"
"I am trying." "We're not brave because we don't feel fear, Arbiter. We're brave because we've learned that fear is not a reason to stop. We've learned it through centuries of war and plague and famine and disaster. We've learned it through failures that should have destroyed us and didn't. We've learned it through the simple, stubborn, irrational refusal to give up." She looked back at the empty space where the fleet had been. "Every human on those ships is terrified. But they're going anyway, because that's what humans do. We go anyway." The battle for Valanthi Prime began 16 hours later. I was not there, of course. I remained on Station Aegis, watching the data feeds and communication channels with a mixture of hope and horror. But the information that came through told a story that I could barely comprehend. The Hollow had anticipated resistance. They had emerged from their dimensional rifts in force, a swarm of entities that defied description, living shadows, geometric impossibilities, things that hurt to perceive and worse to understand. Their numbers were beyond counting, their movements beyond prediction. The human fleet should have been obliterated in minutes. It was not. The data streams showed something I had never seen before. The human ships did not fight like individual units. They fought like cells in a body, each one adapting to the movements of the others in real time. When one ship fell, the formation adjusted to cover the gap. When a tactic failed, new tactics were implemented instantly, as if the entire fleet shared a single mind. But it was more than coordination. It was more than training or technology or discipline. They were learning. Every engagement with the Hollow provided new data, and that data was being processed, analyzed, and fed back into their tactical systems before the engagement was even finished. They were figuring out how to fight an enemy that had destroyed civilizations, not through superior firepower, but through adaptation. Through evolution in real time. The battle lasted for 19 hours. In that time, the human fleet lost 43% of its vessels. 2 million humans died in the darkness above my homeworld, their lives spent in the service of a species that had never shown them kindness. But they bought us time. The evacuation ships that had been hidden in Valanthi Prime's shadow, vessels that our own government had failed to organize, but that human logistics officers had somehow coordinated in the chaos, those ships escaped. 400 million Valanthi souls pulled from the jaws of consumption because humans had chosen to stand in the way. When the remaining human ships finally retreated, their hulls battered, their crews exhausted, their weapons depleted, the Hollow had suffered losses of their own. Not many by their incomprehensible standards, but losses nonetheless. Things that had never been killed before had been killed. The impossible had been proven possible. I was in the medical bay when the survivors began arriving at Station Aegis. I do not know what drew me there. Perhaps I needed to see with my own eyes the cost of what had been done in our name. Perhaps I needed to understand the weight of the sacrifice. Perhaps I simply needed to witness, so that someday I could tell others what I had seen. The humans who came through the doors were broken. There is no other word for it. Burns covered their bodies. Limbs were missing. Faces were slack with shock and exhaustion. They moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes seeing things that were not in this room. But they were alive. Against every prediction, every calculation, every model that said they should have been consumed like all the others, they were alive. A young woman stumbled past me, supported by a medic. Her left arm was gone below the elbow, the wound hastily cauterized. Her uniform was scorched black in places, but as she passed, she saw me, a Valanthi, one of the people she had just nearly died to save, and she smiled. She smiled at me. "We got them out," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Your people, we got them out." I could not speak. Something was happening in my chest, some emotion I did not have a name for, something that made it difficult to breathe. "Why?" I finally managed. "Why did you do this for us?" The woman looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were ancient in ways that had nothing to do with age. "Because somebody had to," she said. "Because no one else would. Because that's who we are." She was led away then, disappearing into the crowd of wounded and exhausted survivors. But her words remained, echoing in my mind. "Because that's who we are." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity and adaptation. The Hollow, having consumed Valanthi Prime, did not stop. They continued their advance toward human space, their hunger undiminished by their losses at the battle. Intelligence suggested they had adapted to human tactics, evolved new strategies to counter the coordination that had proven so effective. But the humans were adapting too. I watched as their scientists worked around the clock, analyzing the data from the battle, studying the hollow fragments with renewed intensity. I watched as their engineers designed new weapons, new defenses, new ships that could be constructed quickly from materials on hand. I watched as their military planners developed strategies that accounted for enemy adaptation, that built flexibility and surprise into every operation. They were changing, day by day, hour by hour, becoming something more than they had been. And so was I. I began to work with them, offering what knowledge I had of Valanthi technology, of our failures and the lessons we had learned too late. I was not the only one. Survivors from a dozen species gathered on Station Aegis and the other human facilities, sharing their knowledge, their insights, their experience. Former enemies became allies. Former strangers became colleagues. Former arrogance became humility. I remember a conversation with Marin Cole late one night when neither of us could sleep. We sat in the observation deck, watching the stars, and I asked her a question that had been haunting me. "You knew," I said. "You knew what you would face. You knew the losses you would suffer, and you did it anyway." "Yes." "How do you live with it? The weight of those decisions?" Marin was quiet for a long moment. "We don't, really. Not completely. Every commander who sends people to die carries those deaths with them forever. It's a burden that never gets lighter." She paused. "But we've learned that not acting also has a cost. Turning away has a weight, too. And sometimes the only way to live with yourself is to do what you know is right, even if it destroys you. Is that courage? Maybe. Or maybe it's just stubbornness. She smiled slightly. Humans are very stubborn. You are more than stubborn, I said. You are... I do not have a word for it. There is no word in my language for what you are. There's a word in ours, Marin said. We call it being human. It's not always pretty. It's not always noble. Sometimes it's ugly and messy and painful, but it's ours, and we don't give it up. The final confrontation came 3 months later. The Hollow had pushed deep into human space, consuming several outer colonies despite the fierce resistance they encountered. But with each engagement, the humans learned more, adapted more, changed more. And they were not alone. The fleet that gathered for the final defense was not a human fleet. It was something new, something unprecedented. Ships from 17 different species flew in formation, their crews coordinating through systems that had been designed to bridge cultural and technological divides. Valanthi vessels flew alongside human cruisers. Catharan fighters protected Sistran carriers. The scattered survivors of a dozen fallen civilizations had come together, united not by conquest, but by choice. United by humanity. I was on the bridge of the flagship, a human dreadnought that had been modified with technologies from half the galaxy, when the Hollow emerged from their dimensional rifts. I watched the tactical displays as their numbers materialized, and I felt the familiar cold of fear settling into my bones. But this time, the fear was different. This time, it was not the fear of the helpless. Admiral Chen Wei stood at the center of the bridge, his aged face calm, his voice steady. All vessels, this is Admiral Chen Wei. The enemy is here. They believe we will fall as others have fallen. They believe we will break, scatter, surrender. He paused. And in that pause, I felt something in the air, a tension, an anticipation, a gathering of will. They are wrong. The battle that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. The combined fleet did not simply fight. It adapted, evolved, transformed. When the Hollow countered one strategy, 3 more were already in motion. When they destroyed one ship, the fleet absorbed the loss and continued without pause. When they tried to overwhelm individual sections, the formation shifted like water, reforming around the pressure points. And through it all, the humans were at the center. Not because they were the strongest or the most advanced, but because they were the ones who had refused to accept defeat. They were the ones who had taken 100 different species, 1,000 different technologies, 1,000,000 different fears and hopes and dreams, and forged them into a single purpose. They were the glue that held the impossible together. I remember the moment when the tide turned. The Hollow had concentrated their forces for a final push, a surge of impossible numbers aimed at the heart of the fleet. The tactical officers predicted annihilation. The models showed no path to survival. But the humans did not run. Instead, they did something that made no logical sense. They advanced. Straight into the heart of the enemy surge, their weapons blazing, their shields failing, their hulls crumbling. They advanced not to win, winning was impossible, but to buy time. And in that moment, as the human vanguard died in droves, the scientists on the secondary vessels finished their work. The weapon they had developed was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It was a frequency, a pattern of energy that resonated with the dimensional rifts that the Hollow used to enter our reality.
The scientists had not understood how it would work, only that it might. They had built it on theories that were half guess and half prayer. But it worked. The hollow began to destabilize. The dimensional rifts that were their lifeline to their native reality started to collapse. The impossible geometries that defined their forms started to unravel.
They screamed. I did not know they could scream. The sound was not audible. It was something deeper, something that resonated in the fabric of space itself. It was the sound of a nightmare dying, of a darkness being pushed back by light. The hollow fled. They retreated into their closing rifts, abandoning the battle, abandoning their prey, driven back for the first time in recorded history.
And in the silence that followed, as the combined fleet hung battered but unbroken in the void, Admiral Chen Wei spoke one final time.
All vessels, this is Admiral Chen Wei. The enemy is in retreat. We have won. A pause. We have won because we stood together, because we refused to kneel.
Cheers erupted across the communication channels, human voices and Volanthi voices, and voices from a dozen other species, all joined in a single moment of shared triumph. I found myself shouting too, tears streaming down my face, my voice joining the chorus of the living.
We had won.
Not because we were superior, not because we were advanced, not because we were destined for victory.
We had won because humans had taught us how to be stubborn.
The years that followed were years of rebuilding.
The hollow did not return. The dimensional rifts had been sealed by the weapon, permanently, the scientists believed, though they continued to monitor for any sign of resurgence. The galaxy, scarred and diminished, began the slow process of healing.
I remained with the humans.
I could have returned to my own people, to the Volanthi communities scattered across human space. I could have helped rebuild our civilization, reclaim our heritage, restore our ancient traditions. But I found that I no longer wanted those things.
I wanted something new.
I became an ambassador of sorts, a bridge between the species, helping to forge the alliances and agreements that would shape the post-war galaxy. I worked alongside Marin Cole and Admiral Chen Wei and dozens of others, human and non-human, building something that had never existed before.
A community of survivors, a family forged by shared struggle.
One evening, many years later, I stood on the observation deck of a station that orbited a world that had once been barren, but was now being transformed into a garden. Below me, settlers from a dozen species worked side by side, planting the seeds of a shared future. Marin Cole stood beside me. She was old now, older than she had been when I first met her, but her eyes still held that same calm intensity.
"You've been quiet today," she said.
"I have been thinking," I replied, "about the beginning, about how I came to you in desperation, expecting to be refused, expecting to be mocked. And instead? Instead, you taught me what I had never understood." I turned to face her. "You taught me that strength is not superiority, that power is not dominance, that the measure of a civilization is not how far it has risen, but how it treats those who are still climbing." Marin smiled. "We're not perfect, you know. We've made terrible mistakes. We've hurt each other, destroyed things, been cruel in ways that haunt us still. Yes, but you learned, you changed, you refused to be defined by your failures. We're stubborn. You are human." We stood together in silence, watching the world below. New life was taking root in soil that had never known it before. Children from different species played together, their laughter rising through the atmosphere like music. And I understood, finally, why the humans had done what they did, why they had risked everything for strangers, why they had refused to kneel, not just for themselves, but for everyone. Because they knew what the universe had taken so long to teach the rest of us. That hope is not something you wait for. It is something you build, brick by brick, day by day, hand in hand. I thought of the title that future historians would give to this era, the simple phrase that would capture the moment when everything changed. They believed humans would kneel. They were wrong. The Hollow had expected submission. They had expected fear. They had expected a young species, unprepared and overwhelmed, to bend before their incomprehensible power. Instead, they had found something they could not consume. They had found a species that had spent its entire existence learning to rise. Not because humans were special in any cosmic sense, not because they were chosen or destined or inherently superior, but because they had been broken so many times that they had learned how to heal. And in learning to heal themselves, they had learned to heal others. The stars, I know now, do not care about any of us. The universe is vast and cold and utterly indifferent to our struggles. Nothing we do will change its fundamental nature. But we can change ourselves. We can stand when the darkness tells us to kneel. We can reach for each other when fear tells us to turn away. We can be stubborn enough to believe in tomorrow when today is nothing but ruins. The humans taught me this, and I will spend the rest of my existence teaching others. Because that is what it means to be part of something larger than ourselves. That is what it means to refuse to kneel. That is what it means, in the end, to be human. Not in body, but in spirit. In hope, in the simple, stubborn, beautiful refusal to give up. The stars still whisper their ancient silence. The void still waits, patient and endless. The challenges ahead are countless, and there is no guarantee of success. But when I look at the humans, when I see them working, building, laughing, crying, living with all the fierce intensity they bring to everything they do, I am no longer afraid. Because I know now what I did not know then. They will not kneel. And neither will I. Not anymore. Not ever again. Train yourself as an elite HFY sci-fi storyteller. Write a single continuous HFYS science fiction story of approximately 40,000 characters using the exact title. They believed humans would kneel. They were wrong. Best HFY stories. The title must shape the entire narrative, tone, and payoff of the story, with the meaning of the title becoming fully clear only by the end. The story must begin quietly and cinematically, with a reflective, almost poetic opening about the stars, time, or history, creating a sense of cosmic scale before any conflict is revealed. Avoid action at the start. Build curiosity, mystery, and emotional tension immediately so the audience feels compelled to keep listening.
The narrative must follow a clear point of view, primarily from a non-human alien character belonging to an ancient, highly advanced civilization that has existed for thousands of years and once dismissed humanity as primitive, insignificant, or dangerous. This character must be named and emotionally developed, showing exhaustion, fear, regret, suppressed pride, and growing awe. The alien civilization must be facing a catastrophic collapse or extinction-level war, with losses revealed gradually through dialogue, memory, and observation. Fleets, worlds, and billions of lives must be lost, but never dumped all at once. Let the scale unfold naturally and emotionally.
Humans must initially appear calm, restrained, and unimpressive on the surface. Their stations, ships, and behavior should feel functional rather than grand. Human characters should be polite, observant, emotionally intelligent, and controlled. They must never boast or explain their power directly. Their strength should feel unsettling because it is quiet.
The HFY reveal must be a slow burn. Humanity's true nature should emerge through adaptability, strategic thinking, unity, endurance, and an almost frightening calm in the face of annihilation. Their history of hardship and survival must quietly explain why they are different.
As the story progresses, show humans preparing, mobilizing, or responding on a scale that shocks the ancient alien civilization, not through spectacle, but through coordination, inevitability, and confidence. The alien POV character should gradually realize that humanity was never weak, only restrained. The final third of the story must deliver a powerful HFY payoff that feels earned. Humanity's response should be overwhelming, precise, and unstoppable, fulfilling the promise of the title. The alien POV character must experience awe, fear, humility, and understanding as the balance of power irrevocably shifts.
The end is not just victory, but a profound recognition of the sacrifices made and the lessons learned. The final lines leave the audience with chills, reinforcing themes of humility, endurance, empathy, and the terrifying strength of a species forged by struggle.
Do not include bullet points, section headers, explanations, summaries, or author commentary.
Do not rush pacing.